Good morning, and welcome to the Sunridge Church of Christ. It's great having you with us today, and our prayer is that through our time of worship, that you get closer to God. My name's Rob Gig, and I'm the pastor here, and we really have one simple mandate, and it's this. We want you to be able to get closer to God. It's through the singing that we listen to, through the Lord's Supper, through the Word being opened. And really, that's what it's all about. Worship is about us being able to get closer to God. And so our prayer is that in our time together, whether you're here in the building, whether you're watching it from home, that you simply just are able to get closer to your Heavenly Father, to be able to see the promises that He has, to be able to see all the things that He wants to bless us with. And it's just amazing that we have this opportunity. It's not typical for us to be able to have to look through a TV, but that's what God's given us right now. So we ask and pray that through this time together, that you do get closer to your God. And we thank you again for being with us. We ask a blessing upon you.
Even though we take these emblems every week, every Sunday, what's still difficult about getting around this table is just fully comprehending the depth and significance of the sacrifice. We are three-dimensional beings, basically, trying to understand multidimensional entities. How is it that these three spiritual beings can be separate and yet be one? Luke chapter 1, the Word was with God and the Word was God. Not possible to understand the Holy Trinity, fully understand them until after death. After shedding this physical housing and entering into that spiritual world. And that transition will be overwhelming at first, but Jesus will be there to guide us through it. It's easy for Jesus, or it was easy, I believe, for Jesus to return to this world for his resurrection. Look at how many times angels appeared and then disappeared at will, and even at Jesus' grave. Note the transfiguration where Moses and Elijah appeared with Jesus. In our physically limited world, resurrection is impossible, but not for the Creator. Jesus was tempted just like we are. But I wonder, did Satan actually think he had a chance at success with Jesus? Did he miss that event where Jesus was baptized by John and filled with the Holy Spirit? Jesus was hungry just like we would be after 40 days. However, the Holy Spirit strengthened him. The Holy Spirit gave Jesus the ability to perform miracles and to teach with understanding. For Jesus, the worst part of the crucifixion had to be the separation from God and from the Spirit. Why for 3 days? John 2:19-21, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." He's talking about his own body there. The destruction of that temple was agonizing and complete. We can understand that in our physical world, but for beings unfettered by time became important, both in the execution, 6 hours on the cross, and the resurrection 3 days later. The execution was drawn out from the false accusations, to the flogging, to the crucifixion, and finally to death. Blood is shed, not immediately, finally, as in the sacrifice of bulls and goats and lambs, but over time, through punishment and execution. And of course, the hatred on the Pharisees was on full display. We aren't told at what point the Spirit left Jesus during the crucifixion, but near his death, Jesus asked God why he had abandoned him. Certainly by that point, he didn't even have the power to get off of that cross, but he still could have called on those thousands of angels to rescue him, but he stayed there for humanity. I believe that had those angels been called, that would have been the end of humanity. What is the point of carrying on if these beings cannot be saved and are just going to go deeper and deeper into the depths of depravity? He stayed there for humanity. He stayed there for you and I so that we might be saved. God, unable to have anything to do with sin, must turn his back on that sacrificial lamb, his son, the one who now carried the sins of the entire world to the grave. Was that separation for the entire 3 days? We aren't told that. However, we are told in detail of the resurrection and its consequences. Salvation and freedom from sin for all of us, and a relationship with those spiritual beings within this three-dimensional world until we join them and come to fully understand the value of the price that was paid for us. These emblems are a significant part of what we need to do to remember and also anticipate as we constantly endeavor to live the Christian life. When we take these emblems, we are performing a righteous act by obeying Jesus' command to do so. Let's give thanks for the loaf. Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this opportunity to remember the death of our Savior. And Father, it's difficult for us to comprehend the agony of the separation that took place there. And we're just so grateful that Jesus had the determination and the love for us to make such a sacrifice. This loaf that represents his body, we take now to remember that sacrifice. In Jesus' name. Heavenly Father, we're grateful for the redeeming power of Jesus' blood. Nobody gets through this world without sinning. So it's only by this blood, this sacrifice, that we are made pure, made clean in your sight. We are so thankful for that. In Christ's name.
As we continue on in the study of those who were faithful and were privileged to be able to get on the list of the Hall of Faith, and in verse 22, by faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Joseph. Go back to Genesis. We'll go through and look at some things that we can learn from a man who, I don't know whether you've had the opportunity or the privilege to be able to see Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. How many have seen that before? Wow. Okay. Oh, it's great. It's I even got to see it with Donny Osmond. He played Joseph. That was his claim to fame. But that was a big show on Broadway, and it played in Toronto. It played all over the world. It was a big show. But it depicted Joseph's life. And Joseph was a guy that had a lot of different color to him. He had a lot of different experiences. And we'll get to read this. It starts in Genesis 37. It says, Jacob lived in a land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Now, typically when you see that, this is the account of Jacob's family line, you're going to expect him to go into all the 12 sons that he had, starting with Reuben and then ending with Benjamin, and so on and so forth. But it says this: Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Ziphilah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So the story starts off with Joseph. He's 17 years old. He's a shepherd, and he's spending time with some of his brothers. These are the sons of the two maidservants of Leah and Rachel. And they don't like him because he's a tattletale. He goes back to dad and says, you know what? My brothers are doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and he gives them a report. And it goes on, it says, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So here it gets worse. He's a tattletale, and then his father loves him out of all of them more than any of them. And he makes this ornate robe, Joseph, in the amazing coat of many colors. And it was very ornate, and he gives it to him. And Jacob in no way covers or hides his love and favoritism of his son Joseph. And it doesn't go over with the rest of the brothers. It gets even worse. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. And he said to him, listen to the dream that I had. And he talks about this dream of that he's a sheaf of wheat, and his sheaf gets very strong and grows up, and then a whole bunch of other sheaves, 11 of them, bow down to him. He didn't like that. And then he says, you know what? I had another dream that the sun and the moon and 11 stars, they all bowed down to me. He's like, isn't that a neat dream, brothers? And his dad hears about it, and he's like, are you implying that your brothers are going to bow down to you one day? Are you implying that it even gets to the point that the sun and moon, your mother and father, and your 11 brothers are going to bow down to you? And he rebukes his son. He says, this isn't very good. And so here we see the beginning. He's 17 years old at this age. It's what I talk about, a dysfunctional family, but there's a problem here because he's a tattletale, he's favored, and he has these dreams, and he thinks that he's got these illusions that, you know, one day I'm going to be over you and you're going to bow down to me. And this did not go over very well with the rest of the brothers. They hate him, and they're jealous of him. So not a very good situation. Well, it goes on, and Jacob says, you know, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go into the land into Shechem is where they are at, and I want you to go and I want you to find out how your brothers are doing. So he sends him on his way, and he says, okay, this is great. Sends him on his way, can't find him. They're actually in Dothan, another place, and they get to the place where he is, and he finds his brothers. And he's not accepted with a great amount of pleasure. And it says that when he was far off, when they see him coming in the distance, they conspire and they figure out, how can we get rid of our brother? You know what? We need to kill him. Now when your brothers see you afar off, I don't have any brothers, I only have one sister, but if you come from a big family and your brothers are conspiring to kill you, you know there's problems. And so here he's got this situation that he's going to meet his brothers, and they're wanting to kill him. But Reuben, who's the oldest, says, you know what? We don't want to get involved in this in any way whatsoever. Let's be really careful. Let's not kill him. Let's throw him in a well. So they find an old well, a cistern that has no water, and they throw him in, and they're trying to figure out what are they going to do. Well, Reuben leaves for a while, and Judah, one of the brothers, figures out, you know what? There's some people coming down the road. Why don't we sell him as a slave? So they sell him to some Midianites, and the situation gets to the point where they made 20 pieces of silver for his brother. and they sell him. And listen to what happens. In chapter 39, it says, now Joseph was, or no, I'm going too far. He sees him, I'm way ahead. Where did I go here? 37. I turned too many pages. In 26 of 37, Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, his own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. And so the Midianites merchants came by, and his brother pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his robes and went back to his brothers and said, the boy isn't here. Where can I turn to now? Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. And they took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe. And he recognized and said, this is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. Joseph's not in a very good situation. He gets into trouble with his brothers, and things aren't very good. And it gets even worse. These Midianites that bought him, they get to Egypt, and they're like, you know what? I don't think he's really worth anything. So they sell him to Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was one of, let's read it here. You have to don't go through chapter 8, go into chapter 39. Chapter 38 is totally different, brother, and we won't look at that because we're looking at Joseph today. But in verse 1 of 39, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So here he's been sold to Potiphar, who was one of Pharaoh's officials. He was the captain of the guard. And it's interesting because in the time that Joseph spent with Potiphar, he starts out as his attendant, his personal attendant. And then he's given complete charge of his household because he did such a good job. And then after that, he's in charge of everything in Potiphar's realm because he was so good at doing what he was doing because God was with him. And it says in the middle of verse 6, now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master is withhold nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Things had gotten better for Joseph, and now they're going to get worse again. And we're going to see in Joseph's life, he's got some high points, he's got some low points, he's got some high points, and he's just gone through a high point. He's got sold. That was a low point. He gets sold to Potiphar and is given all kinds of power and authority. He gets a high point, and then his wife notices him. Potiphar's wife notices him, sees that he's handsome, and said, hey, come on. But what was Joseph's full response? How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? He stuck to his morals. He stuck to his principles. He stuck to what God wanted him to do, and he lived righteously. Well, his wife doesn't like this because she's infatuated with this young Joseph lad, and she conspires to bring him in, and this he has a cloak on that day, and she comes in and she grabs the cloak from him, and then she screams, and then Joseph flees, and then the attendants come in. She's like, look at what's happening here. This guy, he's making sport of us, and he tried to sleep with me. He tried to be with me. And then Potiphar comes home, and he's told the story, and he's at a height, but then he goes to a low, because what happens? He gets sold. Or he gets put in jail, actually, and things aren't so great. And he gets put in prison. And in the middle of verse 20, it says, but when Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness, and he granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all the things held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Got a high again. He's in jail. Well, that's not a great thing, but even in jail, he's in charge of everything. And it seems that everywhere that Joseph goes, he's put in charge, because the Lord is with him and the Lord is taking care of him. Well, he's still in jail, and two of Pharaoh's people are put in jail with him that he's responsible for. The cupbearer to Pharaoh, and the baker to Pharaoh, the cook, the chef. And these guys get put in jail, and they have an issue of that they're in jail, and they start having dreams. And they're like, we don't know what these dreams mean. Well, we know that Joseph likes dreams, visions. He had dreams that he shared with his family that didn't go over very well. And they're like, okay, well, I can tell you what these dreams mean, but it's really not me that's doing the interpretation. It's God. If you look in verse 8, it says, then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. He says, it's not me that's going to be interpreting, but God's going to work for me. So tell me what your dreams are, and we'll try to figure this out. So they tell him what the dreams are, and one of them was a dream where it's the cupbearer has his dream that he's to serve wine again to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh drinks from the cup, and it goes into all kinds of different imagery there. And David says, well, what's going to happen is in 3 days from now, you're going to be restored to your position of being the cupbearer to the king. And when you go back to the king, when you go back to Pharaoh, I want you to do one thing for me. This is what Joseph asked of the cupbearer. Just remember me. I'm still stuck here in prison. Even though I'm over you, I want you to remember one thing. Just remember me. Well, the other guy, the chief baker, he likes what he hears about the cupbearer. He says, well, this is my dream. I was walking down the road, and I had these baskets of 3 baskets of food, of baking that I had done, and the ravens came in, and but they kept eating it. He says, what does my dream mean? He says, well, actually, what's going to happen is 3 days from now, you're going to go before Pharaoh, and he's going to cut your head off, and you're going to be impaled on a stick. That's not a good thing to happen. And what happens? 3 days later, the cupbearer is restored to his position, and the chief baker gets his head cut off, and he's impaled on a stick. But what was one thing that he asked of the cupbearer? Please remember me. Please remember me. Doesn't remember him at all, but he gets back. Well, as time goes on, chapter 41, Pharaoh starts having dreams. And he's like, can anybody tell me what these dreams mean? Can anyone explain to me what's going on? Well, the cupbearer, he's like, you know what? I'm reminded that when I was in jail, there was a guy that he heard my dreams, and he told me what was happening. What his interpretation was exactly what happened in my life. In verse 1, when 2 years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He'd been in there for 2 years, still waiting and not heard. And in verse 9, it says, Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man an interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position. The other man was impaled. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Pharaoh goes on and he tells him what the dream is. And he's standing in the Nile and he sees these 7 plump, well-nourished cows sitting there beside him. And then all of a sudden, up out of the Nile, these ugly, gaunt other cows come and they swallow up the healthy cows. He's like, I don't get this. This doesn't make any sense to me. Well, Pharaoh, this is what your dream means. I'm going to tell you what it means. There's going to be 7 years of somebody score. David's phone. Somebody just scored in the hockey game. Great. David or Joseph says to him, this is what it means. There's going to be 7 years of plenty. Your land is going to produce so much grain. It's going to produce so many fruits. And it's just going to be amazing what happens in those 7 years. But after those 7 years are finished, there's going to be a terrible famine. And everything that you've amassed over those first 7 years is all going to get eaten up in the next 7 years. Wow. How can this be? Well, he likes what he hears. He likes the explanation. And then in verse 33 of chapter 41, it says, Now Pharaoh looked for a discerning and wise man. And now Pharaoh, this is what Joseph is saying to him, Now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may be not ruined by the famine. Well, Pharaoh liked this plan and said to his officials, so Pharaoh asked him, Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Wow. So he's been in jail for a couple of years. And then finally the cupbearer remembers him, presents him to Pharaoh, interprets his dream, and he's got into a high point again. He's raised to a point where he's second, none other, to the greatest man at that time on the earth, Pharaoh. And he's given all the power and all the authority to be able to take care of this. And Pharaoh sees something in Joseph, sees that God is with him, that he's favored by him. And so he goes and he's got, things are looking good. In 41, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot and as his second in command, and people shouted before him, Make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh. but without your word, no one will lift one hand or foot in all of Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zephanath Paneah and gave him Azarnath, daughter of so-and-so, priest of On, to be his wife, and Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled through Egypt. And during the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentiful. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it, and Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand in the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping record because it was beyond measure. It just seemed that everything that Joseph touched, it just flourished. And here he's at a high point where everything's going well. He's being blessed. He's 30 years of age, and God has truly shown himself. And he's in charge of absolutely everything. And Joseph says, or people come to Pharaoh and they say, you know what, we're hungry and don't worry about it. Go to Joseph, he'll take care of you. He'll be the one that will take care of you, and just listen to him. Well, then the story changes back to Jacob and his sons, Joseph's brothers, in chapter 2. It says in verse 1, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? There's a bunch of idiots, just do something. He continued, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. So they pack up their belongings, and 10 out of the 11 brothers go down to Egypt, to a land where they are expecting to be able to be taken care of because they're in a great famine. And interestingly enough, who did they come across? None other but Joseph. In verse 6, now Joseph was the governor of the land. The people who sold grain, or the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Sound familiar? As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where did you come from, he asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you're spies, you've come to see where our land is unprotected. No, my lord, they answered. Your servants have come to buy food. We're the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. No, he said to them, you have come to see where our land is unprotected. But they replied, your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. Joseph said to them, it is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother, and the rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you're telling the truth. If not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take the grain back for your starving household. But you must bring your youngest brother, to me, so that your words may be verified and that you will not die. And this they proceeded to do. So what they decide is that, what Joseph decides is, I'm going to take Simeon. And he takes Simeon and he holds him kind of as a bail. Kind of as he has to stay here. And now what I want you to do is I want you to go back to your family, and I want you to bring back Benjamin. He didn't call him Benjamin. He didn't call him by name, but he says, I want you to bring your youngest brother. Now, who remembers who his youngest brother was? What's the significance of Joseph and Benjamin? Brothers from Rebekah. Rachel. Rebekah was his grandmother. Yes, sorry, Rachel. Brothers of the same mother. And Rachel was the last one to be able to have kids. She was loved more by any of the other wives, the 4 wives that Jacob had. And in her old age, she had Joseph, and then she gave birth to Benjamin at that point where she died. You told me that last week, Gord. Yeah. She died giving childbirth to Benjamin. And so here Joseph is spending in seeing his brothers. Remember the brothers who hated him, who were jealous of him, who put him in the system, who sold him off to the Midianites, who just totally ruined his life and left him for dead and didn't care about. These are the brothers, and he's seeing them, and he's like, this is my family. This is my kin. And I've got the opportunity to be able to see all of my brothers. Wow. So he sends them off, sends them back to his dad, and he totally has his servants load them up. They go to buy grain, and so they get the grain, but also they get all kinds of other provisions along the way. Like Joseph is just totally taking care of his brothers, but they're not sure why. And the price was that they had to pay for the grain was some silver. And these packages of silver he put back into their grain bags. And they stopped for the night, and one of them opens up and is like, oh, the money that we were supposed to give Joseph, ruler of Egypt, for this grain is in my bag. And this isn't good. He's going to think that we stole from him. What do we do? Well, they come back, and they bring back the original amount of silver, and they also bring back some more silver. And the problem is, though, is that Jacob is very, very reluctant to send Benjamin. He's like, I've already lost one son. Now I've lost Simeon too, because he's in bondage. And now you're asking me to lose Benjamin as well. It says this. So Judah steps up to the plate and says, Dad, we have to take Benjamin back with us, because if we don't, there's going to be an issue. He's going to put us all in jail, but we have to go back. We have to go get more food. We ran out of the food that we originally bought. And so Jacob relents, and he takes loads his sons up with the original amount of silver, plus another amount of silver, plus a whole bunch of gifts to be able to give to Joseph. And they don't know that he's Joseph. They think that he's somebody else because he's got a new name that was given to him from Pharaoh. And they're to offer him these gifts as an appeasement to be able to get him back. And they take him Benjamin. And Joseph and Benjamin are united. In chapter 43, it says, as he looked and he saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, is this your younger brother, the one who you told me about? And he said, God be gracious to you, my son. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. He was just so happy to see his brother. After he had washed his face, he came out and controlling himself, and he says, I want you to serve them food. So they have a big banquet. And they feed him. And then he sends him back, and he says, you know what? I wanted to find out about your dad. Is he still alive? And really, he's talking about his own dad, Jacob. He says, is he alive? Yeah, he's still alive. So he sends them back. And this time, he sends them back, but in one of the stacks, he places his chalice, his silver goblet, which he drinks from. And he hides it in one of the sacks. And the sack that he hides it in is in Benjamin's. Now, they leave. They find the gold or the silver chalice. And they're like, oh no, we're going to get accused of stealing again. You go back, it gets taken care of. It's not a good situation. But we've got here a situation of where Joseph is at the height. He's in control. Things are going really well, but now his brothers aren't doing very well. And the whole land is in a big problem because of the lack of food and the famine that's going on, and Joseph is trying to take care of all the situation. End of the story comes to this. Judah brings back his father. He brings back his brother Judah. And it gets, well, even before that, it gets interesting. In chapter 45, I'll read this. Benjamin's brought back to him. And then it says, Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants. And he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there is no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I'm your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not distress him and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me there, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no more plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. I think that's a clue of what the writer in Hebrews talks about. By faith, Joseph talked about the time in Egypt and the deliverance of the people. And here we see just a glimmer here of what's happening. And it goes on in verse 8. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Egypt, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you and your children, your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. Joseph sees the big plan of God. And he says, it's not, you didn't put me and sell me to those in Egypt. That was God's doing. You were just the instruments that he used. And don't worry about it. How's my dad doing? That's what he's really concerned about. He says, how's my dad doing? Is he still alive? Great. I want you to bring him here, send this message to him, and I want you to bring him back because there's going to be a famine here, and I want you to move to Goshen. He goes and he tells Pharaoh, his boss, he says, I'm bringing my family here. There are about 75 men that came in addition to their wives, and they all moved, and they bring their herds, and they bring their cattle, they bring their, well, they weren't cattle people, they were sheep people. He brings all their sheep and their goats and brings them, and they set up in the land of Goshen, and they land there, and Pharaoh says, take the best of the land. Take the very best of everything, and take everything. And Pharaoh looks at Joseph's family, at Jacob's family predominantly, and all his brothers, and completely blesses them and gives them the best of everything. Wow. We go to the end of Genesis. The famine is coming to the end. Jacob is dying. In chapter 49, he's just blessed his sons. And in chapter 49, verse 29, then he gave him these instructions. This is Jacob. I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought, along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his son, he drew up his feet into bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Joseph threw himself on his father and wept over him, kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. And the Egyptian mourned for him 70 days. It goes on, and then there's a whole procession of them taking Jacob's body to where the cave was, where the tomb was, that Abraham had bought for him and his wife and for his sons and his grandsons. And he's taken there. Well, then the brothers, they remember something. We sold our brother into slavery. He knows we hated him. He knows we were jealous. And now Dad's gone and we have no one to protect us. I fear that, or we fear that all the power that Joseph has is going to go to his head, and he's going to finally treat us for the way that we treated him. And it's not going to be good. In verse 15 of chapter 50, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God and your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. This was an ongoing thing. I guess the dream really did come true, that they were to bow down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. I am in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Okay, so we've got this large snapshot of Joseph that Moses, when he wrote the book of Genesis, of Joseph. But you know what I find very interesting about this whole account is, yes, he was part of the 12, but what line did Jesus come from? Judah. We don't have a lot of stories about Judah, but we have one story about Joseph, or a big story, a big history of Joseph. Joseph ends up to live 110 years old. And we have this whole history of his life. You know what? Some of the time, when it comes to our faith, we're people that are just a cog in the wheel to make sure that things happen and God uses us. And that's exactly what Joseph was. He was this cog that was used to make sure. And what does he say at the very end? Don't be afraid. I am in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. And here Joseph, by faith, sees that he's in the right place when he's up, when he's down, when he's up. You never hear, "Oh God, where are you? Why am I in jail? Why are you?" At every point, he sees that God is with him. And that's why he makes it onto the Great Hall of Faith. And it wasn't even through his line. It wasn't through the line of Joseph that the Redeemer came. And he talks about the deliverance. He talks about that one day Israel is going to be a great nation. And he was relying on the same promise that God had given his father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That through these people, there's going to be so many nations, and you're going to become a great nation, and God is going to be with you. And so what he does is he does his part. And some of the time, all we have to do is our part to be faithful. We may not be the one that it's going to go through, that great things are going to happen. But as long as we're faithful and do our part. And that's exactly what Joseph did. He didn't waver. What would you do if your 11 brothers came back to you and you were given the opportunity to repay them? You didn't. No, don't worry about it, guys. God was using me in a very special way. He's using our whole family in a very special way. We need to remember when we sat around the fire, when we were at night and listening to the sheep as they were lowing and doing all their things. Remember what we talk about? The promise that was given to our father Jacob. But it wasn't the promise that was given to Jacob. It was given to Isaac, our great-grandfather, and then our great-grandfather was given to Abraham. Remember that promise? And that's what we're relying on, that someday we're going to have a land that is going to be ours and we're going to be a great nation. And I'm just part of that. And you're part of it. And I don't know what's going to happen in the next generation. I don't know that yet, is what Joseph is thinking in his mind. But I'm going to do my part. And I'm going to be faithful. And God's going to use our family to do amazing things. And there's going to be a deliverer. There's going to be a Messiah. And it's going to come from our family. So we all have to do our part. I'm just doing. And that's why I think Moses, in his writing, spent so much time talking about Joseph. It's interesting because it's all about Jacob. And then in chapter 49, it goes back to Jacob where he blesses all his sons. But for about 8 chapters, it's all about Joseph. Not even in the line of Jesus. But he did his part in order to lift up those who would be in that line. And he didn't give up. And at every point, he did it with pride. He did it with confidence. He did it with his assurance that God was with him and it was all about him. He served him faithfully.